This isn't your seat. 4 simple words that would cost an entire airline crew their careers in less than 4 minutes. What they didn't know was that the woman in the simple navy blazer and comfortable flats standing before them owned 43% of Pacific Airways and had just returned from a board meeting where they'd discussed staff conduct complaints that had been flooding their customer service department for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Angela Washington adjusted the strap of her worn leather messenger bag and looked down at the boarding pass in her hand. Seat 2A, first class. The same seat she'd occupied on dozens of flights between Los Angeles and Seattle over the past 3 years, as she'd built her consulting empire from a one-woman operation into a multi-million-dollar firm that now employed over 200 people across the West Coast. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was returning from a meeting where Pacific Airways executives had specifically asked her to investigate reports of discriminatory treatment aboard their flights. As the founder of Washington Equity Solutions, Angela specialized in organizational transformation, helping corporations identify and eliminate systemic biases that were costing them both talent and customers. Her reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths had made her one of the most sought-after consultants in the country, commanding fees that reflected both her expertise and her results. But standing in the aisle of Flight 447 on this Tuesday afternoon in October, Angela looked nothing like the polished executive who had just left a boardroom full of suits and power ties. She'd deliberately chosen her most understated outfit for the return journey, a simple navy blazer from Target, dark jeans, and comfortable walking shoes. Her natural hair was pulled back in a low bun, and she wore minimal makeup. The transformation was intentional. Some of her most valuable insights came from observing how organizations treated people when they thought no one important was watching. The Boeing 737 hummed with the quiet efficiency of pre-flight preparations. Overhead compartments clicked shut as passengers settled into their seats. The familiar sounds of air conditioning and muted conversations created a backdrop that Angela had grown accustomed to during her frequent travels. She'd flown this exact route 47 times in the past year alone, shuttling between her main office in Los Angeles and the Seattle branch that was rapidly becoming her most profitable location. Angela had purchased Pacific Airways stock 3 years ago, not as an investment strategy, but as a statement of faith in a company that had publicly committed to diversity and inclusion initiatives. Her initial purchase of 10,000 shares had grown into a substantial holding as the airline's value increased, making her one of their largest individual shareholders. More importantly, her expertise in organizational behavior had caught the attention of Pacific Airways' leadership team, leading to a consulting contract that was both personally meaningful and financially significant. The first-class cabin stretched before her with its cream leather seats and polished wood accents. Each seat was a small sanctuary of comfort, designed to make the 3-hour flight feel like minutes rather than hours. The overhead bins were crafted from brushed aluminum, and the carpet beneath her feet was a deep burgundy that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of quiet luxury. This was her world, or at least it had been for the past several years, as her business had grown and her travel had become increasingly frequent. But today felt different. Today she wasn't Dr. Angela Washington, the consultant whose recommendations could reshape entire corporate cultures. Today she was simply a passenger with a valid ticket, testing the very systems she'd been hired to evaluate. The boarding process had been smooth until this moment. She'd cleared security without incident, grabbed a coffee from her favorite spot near Gate B12, and even managed to return a few emails while waiting for her boarding group to be called. The gate agent had scanned her boarding pass with the same mechanical efficiency she'd witnessed hundreds of times before, offering the standard, "Have a nice flight," with a smile that seemed genuine enough. Walking down the jet bridge, Angela had mentally prepared herself for what she might observe during the flight. Her consulting work had taught her that discrimination rarely announced itself with obvious fanfare. Instead, it lived in the small moments, the subtle differences in treatment, the assumptions that people made based on appearances rather than reality. She developed a keen eye for these microaggressions, the tiny cuts that could collectively create hostile environments for people who didn't fit expected molds. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with practiced precision. There was something almost choreographic about their movements, each person playing their role in the complex dance of commercial aviation. Safety demonstrations, overhead bin checks, and passenger assistance all flowed together in a rhythm that spoke to years of training and experience. But as Angela approached her assigned seat, she noticed something that made her pause. The flight attendant standing near the front of the cabin was watching her with an expression that didn't match the professional courtesy she'd observed moments earlier. There was something calculating in that gaze, an assessment that seemed to go beyond the typical passenger evaluation that crew members performed as part of their security protocols. Angela had seen that look before. It was the same expression she'd witnessed in corporate boardrooms when someone walked in who didn't match the expected demographic for that particular space. It was the look of someone making assumptions, drawing conclusions based on appearance rather than credentials. It was exactly the kind of subtle discrimination that her clients hired her to identify and eliminate. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Rebecca Torres, was a woman in her mid-40s with auburn hair pulled into a sleek bun and a uniform that suggested years of experience in the industry. Her makeup was flawless, her posture perfect, and her smile was the kind of practiced expression that could be turned on and off like a light switch depending on the situation. She'd been watching Angela's approach with increasing intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense to her. Rebecca had worked for Pacific Airways for over 15 years, starting as a ground crew member and working her way up to senior flight attendant. She prided herself on being able to read passengers, to anticipate their needs, and manage potential problems before they escalated. But something about this particular passenger bothered her. The woman didn't look like she belonged in first class. Not in those clothes. Not with that casual confidence that suggested she wasn't impressed by the premium cabin's luxury. In Rebecca's experience, first-class passengers fell into predictable categories. There were the business executives in expensive suits, talking loudly on phones about deals and meetings. There were the wealthy retirees, often traveling in pairs, who treated flight attendants like personal servants. There were the occasional celebrities or politicians, usually trying to maintain low profiles while enjoying the perks of premium travel. And there were the upgraded passengers, usually frequent flyers who'd been bumped up from economy, who showed their gratitude through excessive politeness and careful behavior. But Angela didn't fit any of these categories. She looked too young to be a wealthy retiree, too casually dressed to be a business executive, and too composed to be someone excited about an unexpected upgrade. Rebecca's mental categorization system was failing her, and that made her uncomfortable. In her world, passengers who didn't fit expected patterns were potential problems waiting to happen. The moment stretched between them as Angela continued her approach to seat 2A. Other passengers moved around them, focused on their own boarding routines, unaware that they were about to witness an interaction that would fundamentally change how Pacific Airways operated. The casual conversations, the rustling of carry-on bags, and the gentle hum of the aircraft's systems created a soundtrack for what was about to unfold. Angela could feel Rebecca's scrutiny intensifying with each step. It was the kind of attention that made skin crawl, the feeling of being evaluated and found wanting based on criteria that had nothing to do with her qualifications or her right to be in that space. She'd experienced it before. In corporate offices where she was the only black woman in a room full of executives, in restaurants where hostesses assumed she couldn't afford the prices, in retail stores where security guards followed her movements with suspicious eyes. But this felt different. This was her airline, in a very real sense. Her investment in Pacific Airways wasn't just financial, it was personal. She believed in the company's stated commitment to equality and inclusion. She'd staked her professional reputation on helping them live up to those values. And now she was about to discover whether those commitments were genuine or merely corporate window dressing designed to appease critics and attract diverse customers. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. In less than a week, she will be presenting her preliminary findings to Pacific Airways' executive team, offering recommendations for improving their organizational culture and eliminating discriminatory practices. Her report would include specific examples of how bias manifested in their operations, supported by data she'd collected through interviews, surveys, and direct observation. But she hadn't expected to become a case study in her own research. As she finally reached seat 2A, Angela placed her hand on the headrest and looked down at her boarding pass one more time. The information was clear and unambiguous. Her name, her seat assignment, her confirmation number. Everything was in order. just as it had been on the 46 previous flights she'd taken on this route. But Rebecca Torres was now standing directly in front of her, blocking access to the seat with a stance that suggested confrontation rather than assistance. The cabin around them continued its pre-flight preparations, but Angela sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations had grown quieter, and she could feel other passengers becoming aware that something unusual was happening in the premium section. The stage was being set for a confrontation that none of them could have anticipated, least of all Rebecca Torres, who had no idea that her next words would trigger a chain of events that would reach the highest levels of Pacific Airways' corporate structure. Angela took a deep breath and prepared herself for whatever was about to unfold. Her years of consulting work had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to gather information before reacting, and to document everything that might be relevant later. These skills would serve her well in the next few minutes, as would her intimate knowledge of Pacific Airways policies, procedures, and corporate hierarchy. The woman standing before Rebecca Torres might have looked like an ordinary passenger who'd somehow ended up with a first-class ticket she didn't deserve, but appearances could be deceiving. In less than 4 minutes, everyone in that cabin would learn just how dangerous it could be to make assumptions based on someone's appearance, rather than investigating the reality of who they really were. The words came sharp and final, cutting through the ambient noise of the boarding cabin like a blade. "This isn't your seat." Rebecca Torres delivered the statement with the kind of authority that came from 15 years of managing passengers who didn't understand their place in the complex hierarchy of commercial aviation. Her voice carried just enough volume to ensure that nearby passengers would hear, a deliberate choice designed to create social pressure that would make the woman in the navy blazer back down without further argument. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Angela Washington looked up from her boarding pass, meeting Rebecca's gaze with steady composure. The flight attendant's expression held no uncertainty, no hint that she might be making a mistake. This was a woman who believed absolutely in her assessment of the situation, confident that she was protecting the integrity of Pacific Airways' premium cabin from someone who clearly didn't belong there. "I'm sorry, could you clarify what you mean?" Angela's voice remained level, professional. She'd learned long ago that the first response to discrimination should always be a request for explanation, giving the other person an opportunity to recognize their error and correct course before the situation escalated beyond repair. Rebecca's smile was the practiced expression of someone who dealt with difficult passengers on a regular basis. It held no warmth, only the kind of condescending patience typically reserved for children who needed to be taught basic rules of behavior. "Ma'am, I can see that you're holding what appears to be a boarding pass, but first class is reserved for passengers who have specifically purchased premium tickets or qualified for complimentary upgrades through our loyalty program." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Rebecca wasn't simply questioning Angela's ticket. She was questioning her right to be in that space, based on an assessment that had nothing to do with documentation and everything to do with appearance. The navy blazer from Target, the comfortable shoes, the understated jewelry, all of it had been cataloged and judged inadequate for the cream leather seats and brushed aluminum fixtures of the premium cabin. "I understand the policy," Angela replied, extending her boarding pass toward Rebecca. "Would you like to verify my seat assignment?" But Rebecca made no move to take the document. Instead, she glanced around the cabin with theatrical concern, as if Angela's presence posed some kind of threat to the other passengers who were settling into their seats. A businessman in an expensive suit looked up from his laptop, clearly intrigued by the developing confrontation. An elderly woman in pearls and a designer handbag paused in organizing her carry-on items, her attention drawn to the tension building near seat 2A. "The issue isn't really about the boarding pass," Rebecca continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who was being deliberately obtuse. "Sometimes passengers receive documents that don't accurately reflect their actual seat assignments. System errors, printing mistakes, fraudulent tickets. These things happen more often than you might think." The accusation was clear even though it hadn't been stated directly. Rebecca was suggesting that Angela was either the victim of a mistake or, more likely, actively attempting to deceive her way into a seat she hadn't paid for. The careful phrasing allowed Rebecca to make her point while maintaining plausible deniability if challenged later about her treatment of the passenger. Angela felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied these moments of recognition. This wasn't confusion or miscommunication. This was deliberate discrimination wrapped in corporate policy language. She'd seen it countless times in her consulting work. Employees who had learned to weaponize procedures and regulations to exclude people they deemed unworthy, always careful to maintain the appearance of following proper protocols. "What would you suggest I do to resolve this situation?" Angela asked, still holding out her boarding pass. The question was both genuine and strategic. If Rebecca continued to refuse to verify the documentation, it would become increasingly clear that her objections weren't based on procedure, but on prejudice. Rebecca's response confirmed Angela's suspicions. Rather than taking the boarding pass to scan it at the nearby terminal, she pointed toward the back of the aircraft with a gesture that was meant to appear helpful but carried unmistakable undertones of dismissal. "I'd recommend checking with the gate agent about your actual seat assignment. In the meantime, I'm sure we can find you a comfortable spot in our main cabin where you'll be much more." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Where you'll be more appropriately accommodated." The phrase "more appropriately accommodated" struck Angela like a physical blow. It was corporate speak for "where you belong," a polite way of suggesting that someone like her had no business in the premium section of the aircraft. Rebecca had managed to convey her message without using explicitly discriminatory language, a skill that suggested this wasn't her first time navigating this particular type of confrontation. Other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction with increasing interest. The businessman had abandoned any pretense of working on his laptop, watching the exchange with the kind of fascination typically reserved for reality television. A young woman across the aisle had pulled out her phone, though whether she intended to record the interaction or simply wanted to be ready to document whatever happened next wasn't immediately clear. Angela glanced around the cabin, noting the growing audience for what was becoming a public spectacle. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd been hired to investigate, the moment when discrimination moved from private prejudice to public performance, when the treatment of one passenger sent a message to everyone else about who belonged and who didn't. "I appreciate your concern about seating arrangements," Angela said, her tone remaining steady despite the growing tension. "However, I'd prefer to have my boarding pass verified before making any changes to my travel plans. It should only take a moment to confirm my seat assignment in your system." Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was being asked to perform the basic customer service task of verifying a passenger's documentation, but doing so would undermine the narrative she'd constructed about Angela's presence in first class. If the boarding pass scanned correctly, Rebecca would be forced to acknowledge that her assumptions had been wrong, a possibility that seemed increasingly uncomfortable for her to contemplate. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years, Rebecca said, her professional mask beginning to slip. "I can tell when someone belongs in first class and when they don't. It's not just about having a piece of paper. It's about understanding the expectations and standards that come with premium service." The statement was remarkable in its honesty. Rebecca had essentially admitted that her assessment of passengers was based on criteria beyond their actual tickets or seat assignments. She was gatekeeping access to first class based on her personal evaluation of who looked like they belonged there, using subjective standards that had nothing to do with Pacific Airways' actual policies. Angela felt a surge of professional interest despite her personal frustration. This was exactly the kind of systematic bias that her research had identified in preliminary interviews with Pacific Airways employees. The idea that first class was somehow reserved for people who met certain unspoken criteria, regardless of their actual tickets or loyalty status, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how the airline's policies were supposed to work. "Could you help me understand what those expectations and standards are?" Angela asked. "I want to make sure I'm meeting all the requirements for passengers in this section." The question put Rebecca in an impossible position. She couldn't articulate her actual criteria. That Angela didn't look wealthy enough, professional enough, or frankly, white enough to belong in first class, without exposing herself to discrimination charges. But she also couldn't back down from her position without losing face in front of the other passengers who were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. Rebecca's solution was to escalate the situation, bringing in additional authority to support her position. She raised her hand to signal another crew member, a young man who had been preparing the galley for departure. He approached with the kind of eager energy that suggested he was relatively new to the job and anxious to prove himself to his more experienced colleagues. "Marcus, could you assist me with a seating issue?" Rebecca asked. her tone suggesting that Angela was the problem that needed to be solved, rather than a customer who deserved assistance. Marcus Chen had been working for Pacific Airways for just 8 months, still navigating the complex social dynamics of airline crews and learning the unspoken rules that governed passenger interactions. He was 26 years old, ambitious, and eager to impress senior staff members like Rebecca, who could influence his career trajectory within the company. Looking at Angela, then at Rebecca, Marcus immediately understood that he was being asked to choose sides in a confrontation where the senior flight attendant had already made her position clear. The pressure to support his colleague was enormous, especially given the public nature of the situation and the potential career consequences of challenging Rebecca's judgment. "What seems to be the issue?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he was already inclined to support whatever position Rebecca had taken. "This passenger appears to have some confusion about her seat assignment," Rebecca explained, using language that placed the blame squarely on Angela while positioning herself as a helpful professional trying to resolve a difficult situation. "I've tried to explain our first-class policies, but she seems resistant to accepting alternative seating arrangements." The framing was masterful in its manipulation. Rebecca had transformed Angela from a passenger with a valid ticket into a problem customer who was refusing to accept reasonable solutions to a seating mix-up. Marcus, lacking context about how the situation had developed, accepted Rebecca's narrative at face value. "Ma'am, if there's a problem with your ticket, we'll definitely get it sorted out," Marcus said to Angela, his tone reflecting the kind of patronizing patience typically used with difficult children. "But in the meantime, we need to keep the boarding process moving. Would you mind taking a seat in the main cabin while we work on resolving this?" Angela realized she was now facing 2 crew members who had decided her fate based on assumptions rather than evidence. The situation had moved beyond simple discrimination into active exclusion, with multiple employees now invested in removing her from first class regardless of her actual ticket or seat assignment. "I understand your concern about the boarding process," Angela said, maintaining her composure despite the mounting pressure. "But I'd still like my boarding pass verified before making any decisions about alternative seating. It's a simple process that should resolve any questions about my seat assignment." Rebecca and Marcus exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their shared assessment of the situation. They'd both decided that Angela was being unreasonably difficult, refusing to accept their helpful attempts to resolve what they'd determined was obviously a ticketing error. The fact that they'd made this determination without actually checking her documentation seemed irrelevant to their evaluation of the circumstances. "Ma'am, we're trying to help you here," Marcus said, his patience beginning to wear thin. "But you need to work with us. First class isn't just about having a boarding pass. There are standards, expectations, a certain level of service that requires passengers who understand and appreciate the premium experience." The statement was even more explicit than Rebecca's earlier comments. Marcus was essentially arguing that first class was reserved for a particular type of person, someone who met undefined criteria that went far beyond purchasing a ticket or earning an upgrade. He was gatekeeping access to the premium cabin based on his assessment of whether Angela fit his mental model of a first-class passenger. Angela looked around the cabin one more time, noting the growing audience of passengers who were witnessing this interaction. Some seemed uncomfortable with what they were observing, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. Others appeared entertained by the drama, watching with the kind of fascination typically reserved for public spectacles. A few were clearly documenting the exchange on their phones, though whether they were sympathetic to her situation or simply capturing content for social media entertainment wasn't immediately clear. The moment had arrived when Angela would need to decide how to respond to this escalating discrimination. She could continue attempting to reason with Rebecca and Marcus, hoping that logic and proper procedure would eventually prevail. She could comply with their demands and accept a seat in the economy, avoiding further confrontation but validating their prejudiced assumptions. Or she could take a different approach entirely, one that would fundamentally change the power dynamics of the situation and expose the systematic problems that had led to this moment. What Rebecca Torres and Marcus Chen didn't know was that their next few minutes of conversation were about to become part of a corporate case study in how discrimination could destroy careers, damage reputations, and fundamentally alter the trajectory of an entire organization. They were about to learn that assumptions based on appearance could be catastrophically wrong, and that the quiet woman in the navy blazer represented consequences far beyond anything they could imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every policy, procedure, and stated value that Pacific Airways claimed to uphold. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the first-class cabin with military precision, each step deliberate and commanding. Captain David Harrison emerged from the cockpit, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his uniform pressed to crisp perfection. At 58 years old, he carried himself with the kind of unshakable authority that came from 35 years in commercial aviation, including 12 years as a Pacific Airways captain. Harrison had built his reputation on running tight ships and maintaining absolute control over every aspect of his flights. His passenger satisfaction scores were consistently among the highest in the company, largely because he dealt with problems swiftly and decisively, never allowing minor issues to escalate into major disruptions. When Rebecca had discreetly signaled that they had a situation developing in first class, he knew it was time to personally intervene before the boarding process was further delayed. "What's the nature of the problem here?" Harrison's voice cut through the tension with the kind of authority that typically ended disputes before they could develop further. His presence immediately shifted the dynamics in the cabin, drawing the attention of every passenger within earshot, and lending additional weight to whatever resolution he might impose. Rebecca straightened, clearly relieved that backup had arrived. "Captain Harrison, we have a passenger who's claiming a first-class seat, but there seem to be some irregularities with her documentation. Marcus and I have been trying to assist her in finding appropriate alternative seating, but she's been resistant to our suggestions." The summary was a masterclass in narrative manipulation. Rebecca had managed to present herself and Marcus as helpful professionals dealing with an unreasonable customer, while positioning Angela as someone who was causing unnecessary disruption over what appeared to be a simple seating mix-up. Harrison, lacking context about how the situation had developed, accepted Rebecca's framing at face value. Angela watched the captain's expression shift as he processed Rebecca's explanation. She could see him mentally categorizing the situation, applying his experience with passenger management to determine the most efficient resolution. His gaze swept over her appearance, taking in the target blazer, the comfortable shoes, the understated jewelry, and she could practically see him reaching the same conclusions that Rebecca and Marcus had drawn. "Ma'am, I understand there might be some confusion about your seat assignment," Harrison said, his tone carrying the kind of paternal authority that suggested he was being generous by personally addressing her concerns. "However, we need to complete our boarding process efficiently. If you could work with my crew to find you an appropriate seat, we can get everyone settled and on our way to Seattle." The phrase "appropriate seat" carried the same implications as Rebecca's earlier language. Harrison wasn't simply trying to resolve a seating dispute. He was reinforcing the crew's assessment that Angela didn't belong in first class. His intervention was meant to add enough authority to the situation that she would comply with their demands without further argument. "Captain, I appreciate your concern about efficiency," Angela replied, maintaining her professional composure despite the mounting pressure from 3 crew members. "I'd be happy to resolve this quickly by having someone verify my boarding pass in your system. It should take less than 30 seconds to confirm my seat assignment." Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't accustomed to passengers who continued to argue after he'd personally intervened in a situation. In his experience, most people deferred to his authority once he'd made his position clear. Angela's persistence suggested either exceptional stubbornness or some kind of underlying issue that he hadn't yet identified. "Ma'am, my crew members are experienced professionals who are fully capable of assessing passenger documentation," Harrison said, his patience beginning to show signs of strain. "If they've determined that there's an issue with your seating assignment, I'm confident in their judgment. Now, I need you to work with us to find a resolution that gets this flight moving on schedule." The statement was remarkable in its circular logic. Harrison was essentially arguing that his crew's judgment about Angela's seat assignment was correct because they were experienced, while simultaneously refusing to have them perform the basic verification process that would either confirm or refute their assessment. He was prioritizing crew authority over actual documentation, a decision that spoke to deeper assumptions about who deserved the benefit of the doubt in ambiguous situations. Angela realized she was now facing a unified front of 3 crew members who had invested their professional reputations in the narrative that she didn't belong in first class. Backing down would require them to acknowledge that their assessment had been wrong, a possibility that seemed increasingly unlikely as each of them doubled down on their initial positions. "I understand your confidence in your crew," Angela said, pulling her phone from her blazer pocket with deliberate calm. "Perhaps I should contact Pacific Airways customer service to help clarify the situation. They should be able to verify my seat assignment and frequent flyer status while we resolve this matter." The mention of frequent flyer status caused a flicker of uncertainty to cross Rebecca's face. Pacific Airways' elite travelers were a protected class within the company, passengers whose complaints carried significant weight with management and whose satisfaction was closely monitored at the corporate level. If Angela actually held high-tier status with the airline, challenging her seating assignment could have serious consequences for the crew members involved. But Marcus, eager to demonstrate his support for his more experienced colleagues, stepped forward with the kind of cocky confidence that came from being certain he was on the winning side of a confrontation. "Ma'am, calling customer service isn't going to change the situation," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he found her threat amusing rather than concerning. "We're the crew on this aircraft, and we're the ones responsible for maintaining order and safety in the cabin. If you're not willing to work with us, we may need to consider whether you should be on this flight at all." The escalation was breathtaking in its audacity. Marcus had moved beyond questioning Angela's seat assignment to threatening her removal from the aircraft entirely. He was essentially arguing that her refusal to accept their discrimination was grounds for denying her the ability to travel at all. Harrison nodded approvingly at Marcus's statement, clearly pleased with the young flight attendant's show of backbone. In his worldview, maintaining crew authority was paramount to flight safety, and passengers who challenged that authority were potential threats to the orderly operation of the aircraft. "That's exactly right," Harrison said, his voice taking on the kind of finality typically reserved for safety announcements. "This is my aircraft, and my crew's decisions about passenger seating are not subject to debate. Either you accept the alternative arrangements we're offering, or we'll need to make other arrangements for your travel plans." The threat was unmistakable. Angela could comply with their discriminatory demands or face removal from the flight entirely. The crew had transformed a simple seating dispute into an ultimatum that would force her to choose between accepting injustice and potentially missing her business commitments in Los Angeles. Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to react to the escalating confrontation with increasing discomfort. A middle-aged woman in seat 1C had pulled out her phone and was discreetly recording the interaction, her expression suggesting disapproval of the crew's handling of the situation. A businessman across the aisle was shaking his head in apparent disgust, though whether his disapproval was directed at Angela or the crew wasn't immediately clear. Dr. Patricia Kim, a prominent civil rights attorney traveling in seat 3A, had been observing the situation with growing alarm. As someone who specialized in discrimination cases, she recognized the textbook nature of what was unfolding before her. The crew's refusal to verify documentation, their emphasis on subjective standards for first-class passengers, and their escalating threats all represented clear violations of federal anti-discrimination laws. Patricia discreetly activated her phone's voice recording app, ensuring that she would have audio documentation of whatever transpired next. She'd seen enough discrimination cases to know that documentation was crucial, and that victims often struggled to prove their experiences without concrete evidence of discriminatory treatment. In seat 2C, Thomas Rodriguez, a Pacific Airways pilot who was deadheading back to Los Angeles, watched the confrontation with growing professional concern. As someone familiar with company policies and procedures, he knew that the crew's handling of the situation was problematic on multiple levels. They were violating basic customer service protocols by refusing to verify passenger documentation, and they were creating potential legal liability for the airline through their discriminatory treatment of a paying customer. But challenging his colleagues publicly would be a career-limiting move, potentially damaging relationships with crew members he might need to work with in the future. The unofficial code of the airline industry strongly discouraged pilots from undermining flight attendants in front of passengers, even when those flight attendants were clearly in the wrong. The tension in the cabin was becoming palpable as other passengers began to sense that they were witnessing something more significant than a routine seating dispute. Conversations grew quieter as people strained to hear the exchange between Angela and the crew. Several passengers had their phones ready to document whatever happened next, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Angela looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the faces of the people who were watching this interaction unfold. She saw sympathy in some expressions, confusion in others, and uncomfortable recognition in the faces of passengers who had likely witnessed similar situations before. The moment had moved beyond her personal experience to become a public demonstration of how discrimination operated within the airline industry. "Captain Harrison," Angela said, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure, "I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening here. You and your crew are refusing to verify valid documentation for a paying passenger, threatening removal based solely on your subjective assessment of whether I meet unstated criteria for first-class seating. This appears to be discrimination based on my appearance rather than any actual policy violation." The direct accusation of discrimination caused a ripple of reaction throughout the cabin. Several passengers looked up from their phones and newspapers, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing a potential civil rights violation rather than a simple customer service dispute. The stakes of the confrontation had just escalated dramatically, with Angela explicitly naming the issue that everyone had been carefully avoiding. Harrison's face flushed slightly at the accusation. In his mind, he was simply supporting his crew in maintaining order and efficiency, not engaging in discrimination. The suggestion that his actions might be motivated by racial bias was both personally offensive and professionally threatening, given Pacific Airways' stated commitment to diversity and inclusion. "Ma'am, that's a very serious accusation," Harrison said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "I want to be clear that this crew operates according to Pacific Airways policies and procedures, without regard to race, gender, or any other protected characteristic. Our concerns about your seating assignment are based solely on documentation irregularities, not on any personal characteristics." But even as Harrison denied discriminatory intent, his refusal to have Angela's documentation verified undermined his argument. If their concerns were genuinely about documentation irregularities, the obvious solution would be to check the documentation rather than continuing to debate the matter. Their persistent avoidance of this simple step suggested that they weren't concerned about what the verification process might reveal. Rebecca, sensing that the situation was becoming more complex than she'd anticipated, attempted to regain control of the narrative by emphasizing her years of experience and professional expertise. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Rebecca said, addressing not just Angela but the other passengers who were now openly watching the confrontation. "I've handled thousands of seating situations, and I can tell when something doesn't add up. This isn't about discrimination. It's about maintaining the standards and expectations that first-class passengers deserve." The appeal to experience was a calculated move designed to position Rebecca as a professional whose judgment should be trusted over Angela's claims of discrimination. But it also reinforced the problematic nature of her decision-making process, suggesting that her years of experience had taught her to make seating decisions based on factors other than actual tickets and seat assignments. Marcus, encouraged by Rebecca's statement and eager to demonstrate his own professional credentials, added his voice to the chorus of crew authority. "We're trained to recognize when passengers don't match their documentation," Marcus said, his tone suggesting that he was sharing insider knowledge that civilian passengers wouldn't understand. "It's part of our security protocols, making sure that people are who they claim to be and that they're in seats they're actually entitled to occupy." The invocation of security concerns was a new escalation, suggesting that Angela might represent some kind of threat to flight safety rather than simply being a passenger with a disputed seat assignment. It was a transparent attempt to justify their discriminatory treatment by wrapping it in the language of post-9/11 aviation security, implying that their racial profiling was actually a necessary safety measure. Angela felt the familiar surge of professional fascination that accompanied these moments of institutional discrimination. She was witnessing a textbook example of how bias operated within corporate structures, with each crew member reinforcing the other's prejudiced assumptions while finding increasingly creative ways to justify their actions without explicitly acknowledging their discriminatory nature. That embrace, the irony was that their behavior was providing her with exactly the kind of evidence she'd been hired to collect about systematic problems within Pacific Airways' organizational culture. Every statement, every refusal to follow proper procedures, every threat and ultimatum was documenting the very issues that her consulting contract was designed to address. But on a personal level, the experience was exhausting and infuriating. Despite her professional expertise in dealing with discrimination, despite her financial stake in the airline, and despite her valid documentation, she was being treated like a problem to be managed rather than a customer to be served. The crew's actions were a stark reminder that no amount of education, success, or economic power could completely insulate someone from the persistent effects of racial bias. As the confrontation entered its fourth minute, with 3 crew members now aligned against her and an entire cabin of passengers watching the outcome, Angela knew that the moment of reckoning was rapidly approaching. The next few exchanges would determine whether Pacific Airways' stated commitment to equality was genuine or merely corporate rhetoric designed to avoid accountability for discriminatory practices. What Captain Harrison, Rebecca Torres, and Marcus Chen didn't realize was that their victim was about to become their judge, and that their casual discrimination was about to collide with consequences more severe than anything they could have imagined. The silence stretched across the first-class cabin like a taut wire ready to snap. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between their desire to avoid confrontation and their growing awareness that they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong. The crew's unified front seemed impenetrable, their authority absolute, their decision final. Then Dr. Patricia Kim cleared her throat. The sound was quiet, almost delicate, but it carried the weight of someone who had spent 23 years in courtrooms challenging exactly this kind of institutional discrimination. Patricia had remained silent for as long as possible, hoping that the situation would resolve itself without requiring her professional intervention. But the crew's escalating threats and their blatant refusal to follow basic verification procedures had crossed a line that she couldn't ignore. "Excuse me," Patricia said, rising gracefully from seat 3A with the kind of controlled movement that suggested she was accustomed to commanding attention in high-stakes situations. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who knew exactly how much legal trouble the crew was creating for themselves and their employer. Captain Harrison turned toward her with visible irritation. The last thing he needed was another passenger inserting themselves into a situation he was trying to resolve efficiently. His expression suggested that he expected Patricia to either support his crew's position or be quickly dismissed, so they could continue managing what he still believed was a simple seating dispute. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a crew matter that we're handling according to company protocols," Harrison said, using the tone he typically employed to discourage passenger involvement in operational decisions. "I need to ask you to remain seated so we can resolve this situation and complete our boarding process." Patricia's smile was the kind that trial attorneys developed after years of facing down hostile judges and opposing counsel. It was professional, unflappable, and carried just a hint of the knowledge that she held cards her opponents hadn't yet seen. "Captain Harrison, my name is Dr. Patricia Kim, and I'm a federal civil rights attorney with Brennan & Associates," she said, allowing her credentials to settle in the suddenly quiet cabin before continuing. "I've been observing this interaction for several minutes, and I believe you and your crew may want to reconsider your approach before creating significant legal liability for Pacific Airways." The effect of her introduction was immediate and electric. Harrison's confident expression faltered as he processed the implications of having a civil rights attorney as a witness to his crew's handling of the situation. Rebecca's face went pale as she realized that her 15 years of experience might not protect her from the kind of scrutiny that federal discrimination attorneys brought to their cases. Marcus, the youngest and least experienced crew member, looked confused by the sudden shift in dynamics. He'd been so focused on supporting his colleagues that he hadn't considered the possibility that their actions might have legal consequences beyond the immediate passenger dispute they were trying to resolve. "Dr. Kim, I appreciate your professional background," Harrison said, attempting to maintain his authoritative tone despite the obvious concern creeping into his voice. "However, this is a routine operational matter involving passenger seating arrangements. We're following established protocols to ensure flight safety and customer satisfaction." Patricia's response was measured, but devastating in its precision. "Captain, I've been recording this interaction for the past several minutes, and what I've observed appears to be a clear pattern of disparate treatment based on protected characteristics. Your crew has refused multiple requests to verify valid passenger documentation, instead relying on subjective assessments of who belongs in first class. That's textbook discrimination under federal civil rights law." The word recording sent a visible shockwave through the crew. In an era where viral videos could destroy careers and create corporate liability worth millions of dollars, the knowledge that their actions were being documented by a federal attorney transformed the situation from a minor passenger dispute into a potential career-ending catastrophe. But Patricia wasn't finished. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a business card, extending it toward Harrison with a kind of deliberate gesture that suggested she'd performed this action many times in similar situations. "I specialize in airline discrimination cases, Captain. I've handled over 200 similar situations in the past 5 years alone. The pattern I'm observing here is identical to cases that have resulted in significant settlements, crew terminations, and federal oversight of airline operations. Angela watched this development with a mixture of gratitude and professional appreciation. Patricia's intervention was providing exactly the kind of external validation that discrimination victims rarely received in real time. Too often, these situations played out in isolation, with victims having to rely on their own testimony about events that others had witnessed but chose not to document or acknowledge. The middle-aged woman in seat 1C, who had been discreetly recording the interaction on her phone, suddenly found her voice as well. Sandra Phillips was a retired teacher who had spent 40 years working in public schools, where she'd developed a keen sensitivity to institutional bias and its effects on vulnerable populations. "I've been watching this whole thing," Sandra said, holding up her phone to show that she too had been recording the exchange. "That young lady has been nothing but polite and reasonable, asking over and over for someone to simply check her ticket. I don't understand why that's such a difficult request to accommodate." Her statement carried the weight of someone who had witnessed decades of educational discrimination and recognized the same patterns playing out in a different institutional context. Sandra's willingness to speak up provided crucial support for Angela's position, while demonstrating that the crew's actions were troubling to neutral observers who had no personal stake in the outcome. Thomas Rodriguez, the off-duty Pacific Airways pilot in seat 2C, felt the walls closing in around his colleagues. As someone familiar with company policies and federal aviation regulations, he knew that the situation had spiraled far beyond anything that could be justified under normal operational procedures. The presence of recording attorneys and sympathetic witnesses had transformed a manageable customer service issue into a public relations nightmare that would likely reach the highest levels of Pacific Airways management. But his professional obligations were complex. While he personally disagreed with the crew's handling of the situation, openly challenging them in front of passengers would violate the informal codes of conduct that governed relationships between pilots and flight attendants. The airline industry's hierarchical culture discouraged public dissent, even when that dissent might prevent larger problems from developing. Thomas chose a middle path, rising from his seat and approaching Captain Harrison with the kind of collegial deference that wouldn't be seen as insubordination while still allowing him to provide crucial information about the legal and professional risks the crew was creating. "Captain, could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" Thomas asked, his tone suggesting that he had information that Harrison needed to hear away from passenger scrutiny. "I think there might be some considerations we should discuss before proceeding." Harrison recognized Thomas as a fellow pilot, noting the wings pin on his casual shirt and the professional courtesy that his request implied. The offer of private consultation provided an opportunity to receive advice without losing face in front of the passengers who were now openly documenting the crew's every move. "Of course," Harrison said, stepping a few feet away from Angela and the growing crowd of interested passengers. The brief conversation that followed was conducted in whispers, but the body language was unmistakable. Thomas was conveying information that was making Harrison increasingly uncomfortable, gesturing toward the recording passengers and emphasizing points that caused the captain's expression to grow more troubled with each exchange. While the two pilots conferred, Dr. Patricia Kim approached Angela directly, extending her business card with a reassuring smile. "I want you to know that what's happening here is completely unacceptable," Patricia said quietly. "I've been documenting everything, and I'd be happy to provide witness testimony if you decide to pursue legal action against the airline. This kind of discrimination is exactly what federal civil rights laws were designed to address." Angela accepted the card with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Kim. Your support means more than you know. I have to admit, even with my professional background in organizational consulting, experiencing this level of discrimination firsthand is both infuriating and exhausting." Patricia's eyebrows raised at the mention of organizational consulting. "What kind of consulting do you do?" "I specialize in helping corporations identify and eliminate systematic bias in their operations," Angela replied. "Actually, I've been working with Pacific Airways for the past several months on exactly these kinds of issues. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm experiencing the very problems I was hired to solve." The revelation added yet another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary situation. Patricia realized she was witnessing not just discrimination against a random passenger, but discrimination against someone who was professionally qualified to evaluate and address the very problem she was experiencing. The implications for Pacific Airways' liability were staggering. Meanwhile, Sandra Phillips had engaged other passengers in quiet conversation, building a coalition of witnesses who were willing to provide testimony about what they'd observed. Her decades of experience dealing with reluctant parents and defensive administrators had taught her how to build consensus around uncomfortable truths, skills that translated perfectly to organizing passenger support for Angela's position. "I don't care what anyone says," Sandra announced loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "That woman has done nothing wrong, and this crew is treating her terribly. If they can do this to her, they can do it to any of us. We need to stand up for what's right." Her statement prompted nods of agreement from several other passengers, creating a visible shift in the cabin's atmosphere. What had begun as an isolated confrontation between Angela and the crew was becoming a broader referendum on discrimination and passenger rights, with multiple witnesses now actively documenting and supporting Angela's position. Captain Harrison's private conversation with Thomas Rodriguez was reaching its conclusion, and the expression on Harrison's face suggested that he'd received information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the situation. Thomas had explained the legal implications of refusing to verify passenger documentation, the potential career consequences of discrimination charges, and the public relations disaster that was unfolding in real time as multiple passengers recorded the crew's actions. When Harrison returned to the group, his demeanor had shifted noticeably. The absolute confidence he'd displayed earlier was replaced by visible uncertainty and what appeared to be growing recognition that his crew had made a serious error in judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced, addressing not just Angela but the entire first-class cabin, "I want to apologize for the disruption to our boarding process. We're going to take a moment to properly review all documentation and resolve this matter according to our standard procedures." The statement represented a complete reversal of his earlier position. Instead of supporting his crew's refusal to verify Angela's boarding pass, he was now acknowledging that proper verification should have been the first step in resolving any seating questions. The change suggested that Thomas had provided information that made the legal and professional risks of continued discrimination too significant to ignore. Rebecca Torres felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. After 15 years of managing passengers according to her own subjective standards, she was suddenly being asked to follow the actual policies and procedures that Pacific Airways had established for handling passenger documentation. The prospect of having Angela's boarding pass verified in the computer system was terrifying, because it would either expose her discrimination or force her to acknowledge that she'd been wrong from the beginning. Marcus Chin, the youngest crew member, was beginning to understand that his eager support for Rebecca's position might have career-ending consequences. The presence of recording attorneys, sympathetic passengers, and an off-duty pilot who clearly disapproved of their actions suggested that the situation had escalated far beyond anything his training had prepared him to handle. Angela remained calm throughout these developments, recognizing that the momentum had shifted in her favor but understanding that the situation was still delicate. The crew members were now facing the prospect of having their discrimination exposed in front of multiple witnesses, a scenario that could trigger defensive reactions or attempts to minimize their culpability through continued denial. Dr. Patricia Kim continued recording, ensuring that every statement and action would be preserved for potential legal proceedings. Her presence had fundamentally altered the power dynamics in the cabin, transforming Angela from an isolated victim into someone with powerful allies and legal resources. Sandra Phillips and the other sympathetic passengers maintained their supportive stance, creating a social environment where discrimination was being actively challenged rather than passively tolerated. Their willingness to speak up had broken the bystander effect that typically allowed these situations to proceed without intervention. The stage was now set for the verification process that Angela had been requesting from the beginning, a simple procedure that would either vindicate her position or expose the crew's discrimination for all to see. The next few minutes would determine whether Pacific Airways' stated commitment to equality would be upheld or whether the systematic bias that Angela had been hired to address would continue to operate unchallenged. What none of the crew members yet realized was that the verification process they were about to undertake would reveal not just Angela's seat assignment, but her true identity and the full scope of the professional and financial consequences their discrimination had created for themselves and their airline. The boarding scanner beeped with the electronic chirp that had echoed through airports millions of times, a routine sound that typically marked nothing more significant than a verified seat assignment. But in the charged atmosphere of Flight 447's first-class cabin, that simple beep carried the weight of absolute vindication and impending catastrophe. Rebecca Torres stared at the scanner's display screen, her face draining of color as she read information that contradicted every assumption she'd made about the woman standing patiently before her. The boarding pass wasn't just valid. It belonged to someone whose presence on Pacific Airways flights should have been treated with the kind of deference typically reserved for the airline's most important customers. Dr. Angela Washington, Rebecca read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Pacific Airways Platinum Elite status, Seat 2A confirmed. She paused, swallowing hard as additional information populated on the screen. Executive account holder. Board authorized priority passenger. The words hung in the air like an executioner's sentence. Each piece of information represented another nail in the coffin of Rebecca's 15-year career, another layer of professional catastrophe that she had brought upon herself through her refusal to perform the basic verification process that would have prevented this entire confrontation. But the revelation was far from complete. As Rebecca's trembling fingers navigated through the passenger information system, additional details began to emerge that transformed the situation from embarrassing mistake to career-ending disaster. Executive consultant on active contract, Rebecca continued reading, her voice growing weaker with each new piece of information. VIP, passenger protocol, corporate account. Oh, God. She looked up at Angela with dawning horror. It says here you're under contract with Pacific Airways for organizational development services. Dr. Patricia Kim, who had been recording every moment of this revelation, felt a surge of professional excitement. As a civil rights attorney, she'd witnessed many discrimination cases, but rarely had she seen such clear-cut evidence of bias being exposed in real time, with such devastating consequences for the perpetrators. Captain Harrison, who had been standing behind Rebecca as she performed the verification process, felt the blood drain from his face as he began to understand the magnitude of what his crew had done. His 35 years of aviation experience had taught him to handle mechanical failures, weather emergencies, and medical crises, but nothing had prepared him for the realization that they had just discriminated against someone who was essentially their employer. "There's more," Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking as she continued to scroll through Angela's passenger profile. Shareholder information. She owns 43% of Pacific Airways stock. The statement hit the cabin like a physical blow. Sandra Phillips, who had been recording on her phone from Seat 1C, audibly gasped. Thomas Rodriguez, the off-duty pilot who had tried to warn Harrison about the legal implications of their actions, closed his eyes in recognition of the career-ending catastrophe that was unfolding before him. Marcus Chen, the young flight attendant who had been so eager to support his colleagues, looked like he might physically collapse. In 8 months with Pacific Airways, he'd learned about passenger service protocols, safety procedures, and customer satisfaction metrics, but no one had prepared him for the possibility that he might inadvertently discriminate against one of the airline's owners. Angela maintained her composed demeanor throughout this revelation, though inside she felt a mixture of vindication and profound disappointment. The vindication came from having her position completely validated in front of multiple witnesses. The disappointment came from the confirmation that Pacific Airways' discrimination problems were even worse than her preliminary research had suggested. "Is there anything else the system shows about my account?" Angela asked, her tone remaining professional despite the obvious distress of the crew members who had spent the past several minutes questioning her right to be in first class. Rebecca's hands shook as she continued scrolling through the passenger information system. Each new piece of data was more damning than the last, painting a picture of someone whose relationship with Pacific Airways extended far beyond that of an ordinary customer. Unlimited upgrade privileges, Rebecca read, her voice barely audible. Corporate credit account with no spending limits. Emergency contact listed as Jennifer Martinez, Executive Vice President of Operations. She paused, looking up at Angela with something approaching panic. Dr. Washington, it also shows that you have a standing authorization to conduct unannounced quality assessments of Pacific Airways operations. The final piece of information was the most devastating of all. Angela wasn't just a shareholder or a consultant. She was authorized to conduct exactly the kind of investigation that was now unfolding in their first-class cabin. Her presence on the flight wasn't coincidental. It was part of her professional responsibility to evaluate how Pacific Airways employees treated passengers. Captain Harrison realized that every discriminatory action his crew had taken was essentially being conducted under the direct observation of someone with the authority to report their behavior to the highest levels of Pacific Airways management. The situation had moved far beyond a customer service failure into territory that could result in federal investigations, corporate liability, and the kind of public relations disaster that could damage the airline's reputation for years. "Dr. Washington," Harrison said, his voice carrying none of the authority that had characterized his earlier statements. "I want to apologize for the confusion and any inconvenience this situation may have caused. My crew and I clearly made an error in our handling of your boarding process." But Angela wasn't ready to accept a simple apology that would allow the crew to minimize their actions as mere confusion or procedural mistakes. She had witnessed systematic discrimination that went far beyond individual errors in judgment, and her professional responsibility required her to document the full scope of what had occurred. "Captain Harrison, I appreciate your apology, but I want to be clear about what happened here," Angela said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of conducting organizational assessments and presenting findings to executive teams. "Your crew refused multiple requests to verify valid passenger documentation, instead basing their decisions on subjective assessments of who belongs in first class. They threatened to remove me from the aircraft for requesting basic customer service. This wasn't confusion. This was discrimination." The directness of Angela's assessment cut through any possibility that the crew could reframe their actions as innocent mistakes. She was using the precise language of discrimination law, creating a clear record of what had occurred that would be difficult for Pacific Airways to dismiss or minimize in any future proceedings. Dr. Patricia Kim stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to provide additional legal context that would ensure the gravity of the situation was fully understood by everyone involved. "For the record," Patricia announced, addressing not just the crew but the other passengers who were still recording the interaction, "what we've witnessed here constitutes clear violations of federal civil rights laws. The crew's refusal to verify documentation, their threats of removal based on subjective appearance standards, and their discriminatory treatment of Dr. Washington creates significant legal liability for Pacific Airways under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act." Her statement served multiple purposes. It provided legal validation for Angela's position, created additional pressure on the crew to acknowledge the seriousness of their actions, and ensured that any future legal proceedings would have professional testimony about the discrimination that had occurred. Sandra Phillips, energized by the revelations about Angela's true identity and professional role, addressed the other passengers directly. "Did everyone hear that? This woman owns almost half of this airline, and these crew members treated her like she was trying to sneak into first class. If they can discriminate against their own boss, imagine how they treat regular passengers who don't have her resources or legal knowledge." Sandra's comment highlighted the broader implications of what they'd witnessed. The discrimination against Angela wasn't an isolated incident, but rather an indication of systematic problems that likely affected many other passengers who lacked the power or resources to effectively challenge discriminatory treatment. Thomas Rodriguez, the off-duty pilot, finally felt compelled to break his professional silence. The revelation of Angela's identity and role had created a situation where his obligation to protect Pacific Airways' reputation outweighed his reluctance to publicly criticize fellow crew members. "Dr. Washington," Thomas said, rising from his seat and approaching with the kind of deference that his earlier silence had failed to demonstrate. "As a Pacific Airways pilot, I want to personally apologize for my colleagues' actions and for my own failure to intervene more effectively. What happened here does not represent the values that this company is supposed to uphold." Thomas's statement was significant because it provided validation from within Pacific Airways' own ranks, demonstrating that the crew's actions were inconsistent with company policies and professional standards. His willingness to publicly criticize his colleagues suggested that the discrimination had been so egregious that it overrode the informal codes that typically discouraged such dissent. Rebecca Torres, meanwhile, was experiencing the full weight of what her discrimination had cost her. 15 years of building a career with Pacific Airways were evaporating in real time as she realized that her actions had been documented by attorneys, recorded by multiple passengers, and observed by colleagues who would likely be required to provide testimony about what they'd witnessed. Dr. Washington, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with emotion. I don't know what to say. I made a terrible mistake, and I understand that my actions were wrong. I'm so sorry for treating you so poorly. But apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo the discrimination that had occurred or eliminate the legal and professional consequences that were now inevitable. Angela's response was measured but firm, reflecting her understanding that individual accountability was necessary to create meaningful organizational change. Rebecca, I appreciate your apology, but I want you to understand that this isn't just about me. Your actions today represent a pattern of discriminatory treatment that affects many passengers who travel with Pacific Airways. As someone with responsibility for the airline's organizational culture, I have an obligation to ensure that this kind of discrimination is addressed systematically, not just apologized for individually. Marcus Chen, the youngest crew member, was struggling to process the implications of what he'd participated in during his brief tenure with Pacific Airways. 8 months of training and career development were being destroyed by a few minutes of discriminatory behavior that he'd embraced in a misguided attempt to demonstrate loyalty to his more experienced colleagues. Dr. Washington, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm new to this job, and I thought I was supporting my team by backing up their decisions. I realize now that I was participating in something wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. Angela looked at the young man with a mixture of disappointment and recognition. Marcus's situation illustrated how discrimination could be perpetuated by people who weren't necessarily motivated by personal prejudice, but who failed to question discriminatory systems and practices. His case would likely become part of her broader recommendations about training and organizational culture. The revelation of Angela's identity had completely transformed the power dynamics in the first-class cabin. What had begun as 3 crew members exercising authority over a single passenger had become a situation where those same crew members were facing accountability to someone with the power to fundamentally alter their careers and potentially reshape Pacific Airways' entire approach to customer service and employee training. Dr. Patricia Kim continued documenting the interactions, recognizing that she was witnessing not just the resolution of a single discrimination case, but the creation of a comprehensive record that could influence corporate policies and legal precedents far beyond this individual flight. Sandra Phillips and the other supportive passengers maintained their recording efforts, ensuring that multiple independent sources would be available to document what had occurred and prevent any attempts to minimize or distort the events they'd witnessed. The stage was now set for Angela to exercise the authority that her position with Pacific Airways granted her, authority that would determine not just the immediate consequences for the crew members who had discriminated against her, but the broader changes that would need to be implemented to prevent similar discrimination from occurring in the future. The next few minutes would determine whether Pacific Airways' stated commitment to equality and inclusion would be backed up by meaningful consequences for employees who violated those principles, or whether the discrimination Angela had experienced would be treated as an unfortunate incident that could be resolved through apologies and promises of better behavior in the future. Angela Washington reached into her briefcase with the measured precision of someone who had conducted dozens of organizational assessments for Fortune 500 companies. Her fingers found her Pacific Airways corporate phone, a device that connected directly to the airline's executive communication system and carried the kind of priority access that could reach the highest levels of management within minutes. The cabin fell into absolute silence as passengers recognized the gravity of what was about to unfold. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed to quiet as Angela scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a number that would forever change the careers of the crew members who had discriminated against her just minutes earlier. Jennifer Martinez, please, Angela said when the call connected, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who was about to exercise power that few passengers could even imagine possessing. This is Angela Washington calling from Flight 447. We have a situation that requires immediate executive intervention. Jennifer Martinez, Executive Vice President of Operations for Pacific Airways, had been in a budget meeting when her assistant interrupted to inform her that Dr. Washington was calling from an aircraft. Jennifer had worked closely with Angela for months, developing the discrimination assessment protocols that were now being implemented across Pacific Airways' entire operation. A call from Angela during an active flight could only mean that they'd uncovered exactly the kind of systematic problems that their contract was designed to identify and eliminate. "Angela, what's happening?" Jennifer's voice crackled through the phone speaker, audible to everyone in the first-class cabin. Her tone carried the urgency of someone who understood that unscheduled calls from consultants typically indicated serious organizational failures that required immediate response. "Jennifer, I'm calling from the first-class cabin of Flight 447, where I've just experienced systematic discrimination from multiple crew members," Angela said, her professional tone providing a stark contrast to the emotional weight of what she was reporting. Captain David Harrison, Senior Flight Attendant Rebecca Torres, and Flight Attendant Marcus Chen refused multiple requests to verify my boarding pass, threatened to remove me from the aircraft, and explicitly stated that first class was not appropriate for someone of my appearance. The effect of Angela's report was immediate and devastating. Jennifer Martinez had spent 2 decades building Pacific Airways' reputation for customer service excellence, and she understood that the discrimination Angela was describing represented not just a violation of federal civil rights laws, but a fundamental betrayal of everything the airline claimed to stand for. "Angela, I am appalled," Jennifer's voice carried through the cabin with unmistakable authority. "You have my personal assurance that there will be immediate consequences for everyone involved in this discrimination. Can you confirm that you have documentation of what occurred?" Dr. Patricia Kim stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to provide crucial legal context that would ensure the seriousness of the situation was properly understood at the corporate level. "Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Patricia Kim, a federal civil rights attorney," Patricia interjected, speaking loudly enough to be clearly heard through Angela's phone. "I've been recording this entire interaction, and I can confirm that what occurred constitutes clear violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The crew's behavior created significant legal liability for Pacific Airways." Jennifer's response was swift and decisive. As someone responsible for Pacific Airways operations across hundreds of daily flights, she understood that discrimination cases could result in federal investigations, multi-million-dollar settlements, and the kind of negative publicity that could permanently damage an airline's reputation. Dr. Kim, thank you for that information. Angela, I'm implementing immediate emergency protocols. Captain Harrison and his crew are being relieved of duty effective immediately. I'm also dispatching our crisis management team to meet the aircraft upon arrival in Los Angeles. The announcement of immediate termination struck the cabin like thunder. Rebecca Torres, whose 15-year career had been built on what she believed was professional excellence, felt her legs give out beneath her. She grasped the nearest seat back to steady herself as the reality of losing everything she'd worked for finally sank in completely. Captain Harrison, whose 35 years of aviation experience had never prepared him for this kind of professional catastrophe, stood frozen as he processed the implications of being relieved of duty mid-flight. His pilot's license, his pension, his reputation within the aviation industry, all of it was now at risk because of a few minutes of poor judgment that had spiraled into a discrimination case with federal legal implications. Marcus Chen, the youngest crew member, began crying quietly as he realized that his airline career was ending before it had truly begun. 8 months of training, certification, and career development were being erased because he'd chosen to support discrimination rather than question the problematic behavior of his more experienced colleagues. But Jennifer Martinez wasn't finished delivering consequences. As Executive Vice President of Operations, she had the authority to implement immediate changes that would demonstrate Pacific Airways' commitment to addressing the systematic problems that Angela's experience had revealed. "Angela, I'm also implementing immediate changes to our crew training protocols," Jennifer continued, her voice carrying through the cabin with the weight of corporate authority. "Every Pacific Airways employee will undergo mandatory anti-discrimination training within the next 60 days. We're also establishing a direct reporting system for discrimination complaints that will bypass local management and report directly to my office." Sandra Phillips, who had been recording the exchange from Seat 1C, felt a surge of satisfaction as she heard concrete consequences being implemented in real time. Her 40 years in education had taught her that meaningful change only occurred when institutions were forced to confront their failures with immediate accountability rather than vague promises of future improvement. Thomas Rodriguez, the off-duty pilot who had tried to warn Captain Harrison about the legal implications of their actions, felt a mixture of relief and professional sadness. Relief that Pacific Airways was taking decisive action to address the discrimination he'd witnessed, and sadness that his colleagues had created a situation that required such drastic consequences. Angela wasn't satisfied with individual accountability alone. Her role as an organizational consultant required her to address the systematic issues that had made this discrimination possible in the first place. Jennifer, I also recommend implementing immediate policy changes regarding passenger verification procedures, Angela said, using her phone's speaker function to ensure that her recommendations would be heard by everyone in the cabin. Crew members should be required to verify passenger documentation before making any seating decisions, and there should be clear protocols for handling disputes that prevent subjective judgments based on passenger appearance. Absolutely, Jennifer replied immediately. I'm authorizing you to develop comprehensive policy recommendations that will be implemented fleet-wide. This kind of discrimination will never happen again on a Pacific Airways flight. Dr. Patricia Kim, recognizing the significance of having corporate policy changes announced in the presence of multiple witnesses, continued her documentation of the conversation. The real-time implementation of anti-discrimination measures provided powerful evidence that Pacific Airways was taking immediate responsibility for the systematic problems that Angela's experience had revealed. But the consequences weren't limited to corporate policy changes. Jennifer Martinez had additional announcements that would demonstrate the financial seriousness with which Pacific Airways was treating the discrimination Angela had experienced. Angela, I'm also authorizing immediate compensation for the discrimination you experienced, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the authority of someone with the power to make financial decisions that reflected the gravity of civil rights violations. Pacific Airways will provide full reimbursement for your travel expenses, additional compensation for the emotional distress you experienced, and a formal written apology from our Chief Executive Officer. The offer of comprehensive compensation, while important for acknowledging the harm that discrimination caused, was less significant to Angela than the systematic changes that were being implemented to prevent future incidents. Her professional focus remained on creating organizational transformation rather than individual remedies. Jennifer, I appreciate the compensation offer, but my primary concern is ensuring that other passengers never experience what I went through today, Angela replied. The systematic changes you're implementing are more important than individual financial remedies. Sandra Phillips, energized by Angela's focus on broader justice rather than personal gain, addressed the other passengers who were still recording the exchange. Did everyone hear that? Even after being discriminated against by her own employees, Dr. Washington is more concerned about protecting other passengers than getting compensation for herself. That's the kind of leadership we need more of in corporate America. The comment highlighted Angela's character while emphasizing the broader implications of the discrimination that had occurred. Sandra's ability to contextualize the situation for other passengers helped ensure that the lessons learned would extend beyond the immediate consequences for the crew members involved. Rebecca Torres, meanwhile, was experiencing the full emotional weight of losing a career that had defined her identity for 15 years. The realization that her discrimination would be documented in federal legal proceedings, corporate training materials, and potentially media coverage was overwhelming in its finality. Dr. Washington, Rebecca said through her tears, I know my apology can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I understand now how wrong my actions were. I hope that other employees can learn from my mistakes so that this never happens to anyone else. Angela looked at Rebecca with a mixture of disappointment and recognition that individual accountability was only meaningful when it contributed to broader organizational change. Rebecca, your recognition of the harm you caused is important, but real change requires more than individual apologies. The systematic problems that made your discrimination possible need to be addressed through comprehensive training, policy changes, and ongoing accountability measures. Marcus Chen, still struggling with the reality of losing his airline career, approached Angela with the kind of desperate hope that comes from recognizing that personal redemption might only be possible through contributing to broader justice. Dr. Washington, is there anything I can do to help prevent this from happening to other passengers? I know I can't undo my participation in discriminating against you, but maybe I can help train other employees about how discrimination happens and why it's so harmful. Angela considered Marcus's offer carefully. While his participation in discrimination had been inexcusable, his willingness to contribute to prevention efforts suggested that he understood the broader implications of what had occurred. Marcus, that's something that could be discussed as part of Pacific Airways' comprehensive response to this situation. Individual accountability needs to be coupled with contributions to systematic change if it's going to be meaningful. Jennifer Martinez, who had been listening to these exchanges, recognized an opportunity to demonstrate that Pacific Airways was committed to comprehensive reform rather than simply punishing individual employees. Angela, I'd like to propose that we develop a comprehensive case study based on what happened today, Jennifer said. With appropriate anonymization to protect individual privacy, This incident could become a powerful training tool that helps other employees understand how discrimination develops and why it's so harmful to everyone involved. The proposal represented exactly the kind of systematic thinking that Angela believed was necessary to create meaningful organizational change. Rather than treating discrimination as an isolated incident that could be resolved through individual punishment, Jennifer was proposing to use the situation as a catalyst for broader educational and cultural transformation. Dr. Patricia Kim, recognizing the legal significance of having corporate accountability measures announced in the presence of multiple witnesses, continued her documentation while also providing additional context about the broader implications of what they'd witnessed. For the record, Patricia announced, addressing both Angela's phone and the other passengers who were still recording, what we've seen here represents exemplary corporate response to discrimination. Pacific Airways has implemented immediate consequences, systematic policy changes, and ongoing accountability measures that should serve as a model for other companies facing similar issues. The flight was now approaching its descent into Los Angeles, but the conversations sparked by Angela's discrimination and Pacific Airways' response were far from over. The corporate policy changes, individual consequences, and systematic reforms that had been implemented during the flight would continue to reverberate throughout the airline industry and potentially influence how other companies address discrimination within their own operations. As the crew members who had discriminated against Angela prepared to leave the aircraft for the final time as Pacific Airways employees, the passengers who had witnessed their systematic discrimination and its consequences understood that they had experienced something far more significant than a routine flight. They had witnessed justice in real time, accountability implemented immediately, and systematic change created through the courage of one woman who refused to accept discriminatory treatment. The true test of these changes would come in the days, weeks, and months that followed, as Pacific Airways implemented the comprehensive reforms that had been announced during Flight 447's journey from Seattle to Los Angeles. 6 months after Flight 447 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, Dr. Angela Washington stood before a packed auditorium at the National Civil Rights Conference in Washington, D.C. The audience of corporate executives, civil rights attorneys, and diversity professionals had come to hear about the transformation that had swept through Pacific Airways following what the media had dubbed the 4-minute flight that changed everything. But Angela wasn't alone on the stage. Beside her sat an unexpected figure, Marcus Chen, the former flight attendant whose participation in her discrimination had cost him his airline career, but had ultimately led him to become one of the country's most effective anti-discrimination trainers. When I made the choice to support my colleagues' discriminatory behavior 6 months ago, Marcus said, addressing the audience with the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from profound personal failure and redemption, I thought I was being loyal to my team. What I learned is that true loyalty means standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or professionally risky. Marcus's transformation had been remarkable. After losing his position with Pacific Airways, he had dedicated himself to understanding how discrimination operated within institutional settings. Working closely with Angela's consulting firm, he had developed training programs that used his own experience as a case study in how good people could become complicit in discriminatory systems. The most dangerous aspect of discrimination, Marcus continued, is how normal it can seem when you're inside the system. I genuinely believed I was doing my job correctly by supporting Rebecca and Captain Harrison. It took losing everything to understand that I was actually betraying the values I thought I was upholding. Angela nodded approvingly as Marcus spoke. His willingness to take responsibility for his actions while working to prevent others from making similar mistakes had transformed him from a symbol of complicity into a powerful advocate for change. Marcus represents something crucial about organizational transformation, Angela said, taking the microphone. Real change doesn't just come from punishing people who engage in discrimination. It comes from helping them understand how they became part of the problem and how they can become part of the solution. The audience listened intently as Angela described the comprehensive changes that had been implemented at Pacific Airways following the discrimination she'd experienced. The transformation had been swift and thorough, touching every aspect of the airline's operations. Within 90 days of Flight 447, Angela explained, Pacific Airways had retrained over 12,000 employees in anti-discrimination protocols. They implemented real-time verification requirements for all passenger disputes. Most importantly, they created accountability systems that make discrimination professionally and financially untenable for any employee who might be inclined toward biased behavior. The results had been dramatic. Passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment had dropped by 87% in the 6 months following the new policy's implementation. Pacific Airways had become the first major airline to achieve certification from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People for its anti-discrimination practices. Dr. Patricia Kim, the civil rights attorney who had documented Angela's discrimination, had also seen her career transformed by the events of Flight 447. Her real-time legal intervention had become a model for how attorneys could use technology and strategic positioning to create immediate accountability for discriminatory behavior. The traditional approach to discrimination cases involves lengthy legal proceedings that occur months or years after the discriminatory behavior, Patricia explained to the conference audience via video link from her office in Seattle. What happened on Flight 447 demonstrated the power of immediate documentation, real-time legal intervention, and instant corporate accountability. Patricia's law firm had subsequently developed rapid response protocols for discrimination cases, using the Flight 447 model to create immediate consequences for biased behavior, rather than relying solely on after-the-fact legal remedies. Their approach had been adopted by civil rights organizations across the country, fundamentally changing how discrimination cases were handled in corporate America. Sandra Phillips, the retired teacher who had organized passenger support for Angela during the flight, had also found her life changed by the experience. Her documentation of the discrimination and her efforts to build coalition support among the other passengers had led to her becoming a sought-after consultant on bystander intervention strategies. For 40 years in education, I saw discrimination happen in classrooms, faculty meetings, and administrative offices, Sandra told the conference audience. Too often, people who witnessed bias chose to remain silent because they didn't want to get involved, or because they assumed someone else would speak up. Flight 447 taught me that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to document injustice and support its victims. Sandra's bystander intervention workshops had been implemented in schools, corporations, and government agencies across the country. Her approach emphasized the importance of immediate action, strategic documentation, and coalition building in challenging discriminatory behavior before it could escalate or be normalized within institutional settings. But the transformation hadn't been limited to the individuals directly involved in Flight 447. The incident had catalyzed broader changes throughout the airline industry and beyond. Jennifer Martinez, Pacific Airways Executive Vice President of Operations, had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer largely based on her handling of the discrimination crisis. Her rapid implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination measures had become a case study taught in business schools and corporate governance programs. The most important lesson we learned from Flight 447, Jennifer explained during her keynote address at the conference, is that discrimination represents an existential threat to any organization that claims to value diversity and inclusion. You can't address bias through policy statements and sensitivity training alone. You need accountability systems that make discrimination professionally and financially catastrophic for anyone who engages in it. HONCAD. Pacific Airways' comprehensive response to Angela's discrimination had included financial investments that went far beyond traditional corporate diversity initiatives. The airline had spent over $50 million on new training programs, technology systems, and accountability measures designed to prevent future discrimination. The financial investment had paid dividends beyond improved customer satisfaction. Pacific Airways had seen a significant increase in bookings from diverse customer segments, improved employee retention rates, and enhanced corporate reputation that had translated into measurable competitive advantages in the aviation market. Thomas Rodriguez, the off-duty pilot who had witnessed Angela's discrimination, had also found his career trajectory altered by the events of Flight 447. His willingness to eventually speak up against his colleagues' discriminatory behavior, despite the professional risks involved, had led to his promotion to chief pilot for Pacific Airways Western operations. The hardest part of witnessing discrimination, Thomas explained during a panel discussion at the conference, is overcoming the professional and social pressures that discourage intervention. The aviation industry has strong cultural norms about crew solidarity and not undermining colleagues in front of passengers. But Flight 447 taught me that those norms become toxic when they protect discriminatory behavior. Thomas had worked with Angela's consulting firm to develop intervention protocols for airline employees who witnessed discrimination. The program had been adopted by 6 major airlines and had resulted in a measurable increase in internal reporting of discriminatory incidents. The ripple effects of Flight 447 had extended far beyond the aviation industry. Corporate America had taken notice of Pacific Airways' comprehensive response to discrimination, leading to adoption of similar policies and procedures in industries ranging from hospitality to healthcare. Harvard Business School had developed a case study based on Flight 447 that was now taught in MBA programs across the country. The case examined how Angela's experience demonstrated the business costs of discrimination and the competitive advantages that came from implementing comprehensive anti-bias measures. The Flight 447 case study, explained Professor Sarah Chen from Harvard Business School, illustrates how discrimination represents both a moral failure and a strategic business error. Companies that fail to address bias effectively face legal liability, reputational damage, and lost revenue from customers who refuse to tolerate discriminatory treatment. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in Angela's own career. Her experience on Flight 447 had elevated her from a successful consultant to a nationally recognized expert on organizational discrimination. Her consulting firm, Washington Equity Solutions, had grown from 200 employees to over 800, with offices in 12 cities and contracts with Fortune 100 companies across multiple industries. Flight 447 changed my understanding of how discrimination operates and how it can be addressed, Angela told the conference audience. The experience taught me that individual incidents of bias are symptoms of much larger systematic problems that require comprehensive organizational transformation rather than case-by-case responses. Angela's post-Flight 447 consulting work had focused on helping organizations develop what she called discrimination-proof systems, policies, procedures, and accountability measures designed to make biased behavior impossible rather than simply punishable after the fact. The goal isn't to catch people engaging in discrimination, Angela explained. The goal is to create organizational cultures where discrimination simply cannot occur because the systems and incentives make it impossible for bias to influence decision-making. Her approach had been implemented by over 300 companies, resulting in measurable decreases in discrimination complaints, improvements in employee satisfaction across diverse populations, and enhanced corporate performance metrics related to diversity and inclusion. The audience at the National Civil Rights Conference represented the broader impact that Flight 447 had generated. Corporate executives who had attended to learn how to implement similar anti-discrimination measures in their own organizations. Civil rights attorneys who wanted to understand how real-time intervention strategies could be applied to their legal practice. Diversity professionals seeking evidence-based approaches to creating inclusive organizational cultures. The story of Flight 447 isn't really about one woman's experience with discrimination, Angela concluded her presentation. It's about how courage, documentation, accountability, and systematic change can transform individual injustice into broader social progress. Every person in this room has the power to create similar transformation in their own organizations and communities. As the conference concluded, attendees left with concrete tools and strategies for addressing discrimination in their professional and personal contexts. The Flight 447 model had provided a replicable framework for turning discriminatory incidents into catalysts for positive change. But the most powerful legacy of Flight 447 wasn't found in policy manuals or training programs. It was found in the thousands of people who had been inspired by Angela's story to speak up against discrimination when they encountered it, to document injustice when they witnessed it, and to demand accountability from institutions that claimed to value equality, but failed to enforce it. 6 months after Rebecca Torres had said, "This isn't your seat," those 4 words had become a symbol of how quickly discrimination could be transformed into justice when victims refused to accept biased treatment and bystanders chose to support rather than ignore the fight for equality. The lesson was simple but profound. Individual courage, strategic documentation, immediate accountability, and systematic change could overcome even the most entrenched discriminatory practices. Flight 447 had proven that transformation was possible when people chose to fight for justice rather than accept injustice as inevitable. And in conference rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms across the country, that lesson continued to inspire new generations of advocates who understood that the fight against discrimination required not just good intentions, but concrete actions that created meaningful consequences for those who chose bias over equality. The 4-minute flight that had begun with discrimination had become a catalyst for decades of progress, proving that individual moments of courage could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.